One must live under a rock on a desert somewhere not to have heard about the movement. But the question is, which black lives are we talking about? Is it black lives in the States or black lives in Africa and the rest of the world? Whilst the mantra is good, every time a young black man is shot in America, we also live on a continent where malaria kills about what is estimated to be about 7 Boeing 747s loaded up every day crashing into a mountain somewhere. So the question is, which black lives are we talking about? On a panel with me, I have Keenan, Helen, Aisha, and Panache. None of them needs any further introductions, especially because we've got less than 60 minutes to go. So I'll turn it over to Helen, who lives in North America and probably lives this reality every day, to say in a few short words, what does this Black Lives Matter movement mean for you as an African who lives in North America?
Well, thank you, Patrick, for the introduction. Thank you guys for being here, and it's always a pleasure to be at Ake. Yeah, well, to begin from somewhere, I must say at first it didn't mean much to me. It was just something I saw on TV every day and listened to on NPR. And the first time I really started to think about what's happening to black lives in America was when we were driving in the car. I went to my son's school to pick him up, and then we were listening to NPR, and they were talking about yet another black guy that had been killed by the police. And my son, who is 10 years old, asked me, "Daddy, why are they killing black people?" So that was the first time I kind of pulled back and really started paying attention to these things, because here is a small boy, you know, who is disturbed, and he has to grow up in that society. And whatever he becomes, whatever he tries to become, is always going to be judged by some parameters which are not really important, you know, in real life. Well, real enough in America. So that's the reality of it. The other irony is that, like you mentioned, we're talking about Black Lives Matter in Africa, and we're all black, including the policemen, the president, the poor people. We're all black. But why are some black lives more important than other black lives in Nigeria or in Africa, for instance? Of course, one could go on and make lots of, try to explain it. There's a lot of failure of democracy, failure of governance, structural failures that lead to all these things. But the bottom line is that some people are being left behind. Mm-hmm. They are falling through the cracks in our society. Thousands of girls killed, you know, people killed in Borno State, in South Africa. Things happen like that all the time. The thing is, we need our best minds to think about this. Yeah. Before we get into more conversations like this. Yeah.
Before we get into the causes and everything, I wanted to get also from a West African perspective, Keenan, when, yes, coming to you. When you hear that Black Lives Matter, I mean, sitting in Ghana, across West Africa, what does that mean for you?
I hate this question. I do, because I hate the default West African position, which is that we are largely unaware of race, and that every time we get to know about racism when we leave West Africa. I hate that. The reason I hate it because it assumes, on one hand, it assumes it's a presence thing, right? As opposed to it being a structural thing. So the irony of Black Lives Matter can be rephrased as, where has decolonization gone? Because I'm Fanti, but no one came to colonize me as a Fanti. They came, invented race, and enslaved my people. So it wasn't a nation-to-nation thing, but we live our lives very much operating as though these legacy colonial systems, which we have then extra empowered and put on steroids in our countries, and do not exist. And hence this whole idea that it's ironic, or that we don't experience racism, or we are not living in our countries that are also framed by white supremacy legacy systems. So I don't like the default West African position. That's just how I feel about it.
No, I mean, that's
Thank you.
that's welcome and appreciated. We'll look at it again from a South African or Southern African perspective, because whilst we might have some of the vestiges of colonialism still driving some of the things happening in West Africa, in Southern Africa there appears to be a more direct linkage to some of the issues that they're dealing with in North America. So what does it mean for you coming from Southern Africa?
Sure. Thank you so much, Kina, for that intervention, because I think it's irritating at best, but also very frustrating when you hear your African brothers and sisters who continue to dismiss the race issue as if we are just looking for issues and we're just overly sensitive and that kind of thing. And you see that a lot. I mean, for example, when you saw the response to Chimamanda for saying, you know, a white man cannot define racism, and people said she's reverse racist, and oh, we love Trump because blah, 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 blah. And there's a willful ignorance, I find sometimes, and dismissal of these issues. And I say, for me, I think we need to also be particular. We need to talk about settler colonialism, right? That is why, for example, in South Africa, or even a Zimbabwean, maybe a Namibian, maybe to some extent a Kenyan, will understand Black Lives Matter to a greater extent than, you know, for example, Nigeria, which is not a former settler colony. So the presence of white bodies allows us to see race in ways that it is invisibilized here in other African countries. And for me to just understand the nexus of settler colonialism, and because I think also it's a false equivalence to say malaria kills lots of black people, but then there's black people being shot. This is state-sponsored violence. And it's almost a gratuitous violence against black people, such that we get to a point, and at some later on we can talk about my experiences within the student movement and seeing very directly black lives do not matter, but seeing which bodies matter. But particularly, for me, the most important image, or one of the most important images for me in thinking about these things, is when there was that terror attack in Charleston a couple of years ago, I think 2 years ago, when there was a young white boy by the name of Dylan Roof, and he killed black women. And there's also a very particular historical reason why he went to that church, because it was a site of slave insurrection against, you know, slave masters. And he went there and he shot black women. And, you know, if you see sort of pictures of him when he's, you know, sort of, you know, in pictures that came out, there's a picture of him with the old Rhodesia flag, the Confederacy flag from America, and then he had the old South Africa flag. And for me, that is the nexus of global settler colonialism. America is a settler colony. And the thing about settler colonialism is that white property, because the people who own property are not us in general, right? The people who own property tend to be white, so when black bodies threaten white property, it is almost as if that property is flesh. Our flesh can be pierced to make sure that white flesh as property, as actual bodies, can be looked after. So I think those kind of nuances are lost because the bodies are no longer there. But colonialism, I mean, we can talk about Niger Delta and the settler colonial systems that continue, and why black bodies can continue to be shot and killed in the way that they are. So that, I think, thank you very much, Kina, for vindicating the Southern African on the panel.
No, thank you. I'd like to move to Aisha. Every time there's a shooting in America and it's posted on Facebook, you know, there's an uproar in Nigeria, mostly from what I call largely middle class Nigerians, at least people who've got access to those media. But then how do we get these issues further down to a society where, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, that a little 7-year-old boy somewhere in Lagos, trying to quench the pangs of hunger, stole a handful of Gary, and he was burnt alive by Nigerians and people who are suffering the same things he's suffering. Now, how do we cascade this message down to those levels where we understand that these issues affect all of us?
Thanks, Patrick. Well, I mean, in listening to the various discussions here and just online, I don't see a difference between what goes on to black people in America and what goes on to black people here. I think for me, I look at the struggle of black people everywhere as typically the same. From trying to move from being objects to subjects, which is where most of us are, to just being full citizens where we can just be. So for me, I mean, there's 3 ways to think about it. I mean, there are people who say, you mentioned the middle class, oh yes, oh my, this is horrible, you know, because I guess on one hand, it could be them. There are cases of Africans who've gone abroad and been shot. There's Diallo, which is the most famous one. So there is that sense of it could be me, and I think that's fine. That's enlightened self-interest. I could be on holiday. It could be my son in school. So those are valid concerns. And even for those who dismiss it and say, it's not my business, like you said, there are people dying of malaria. There's 145 women dying every day from maternal-related complications here in Nigeria alone. So people will say, I don't care what's happening to black people in America, but in a way they do care. There is a reflection, and even in dismissing what's happening in America and saying it doesn't matter, they're sort of linking it to the fact that even here in Nigeria, even here in Africa, lives don't seem to matter enough. So there's still a connection. And then there's third who just say, anybody whose life is taken unjustly is painful, you know, and I don't have to live there, I don't have to know these people. It's just the sense of injustice is outrageous. And so, you know, I want to do something about it. And so I don't see a distinction. For people on Facebook who lament about the shooting of men in America, I think that the same people who are lamenting about the 7-year-old, there's lots of outrage yesterday, lots of people, which for me, I know that there's been, honestly, not to raise any controversy, but for now, the story hasn't been substantiated. I'm aware of people who've reached out to the police command, who are talking to even, you know, the presidency, trying to verify the story, and unfortunately there isn't. But the truth is, yes, people do get burnt alive. And if 7-year-olds are not escaping that, and there is that very strong sense that, other people say we have lost our sense of outrage. I think the outrage is there. It's just that our lives are very fragile, and I can only speak with authority about Nigeria, but yes, daily you hear about people dying unjustly, people being shot at police stations or whatever, and you get to sort of build some sort of shell around yourself, unless something really outrageous like the death of, you know, burning a 7-year-old alive pierces your armor, and you complain about it. But I guess what we should be discussing is how we move that outrage you know, into something collective that we can do something.
Yeah, before we get to how we get to the outreach and what we do with it, I wonder if we can explore a little bit more how we've gotten to where we are, because it's, and I know you started talking about it. There's a tendency to just, you know, generalize and say, oh, it's the political situation, or oh, you know, but there could be some more fundamental issues that have predisposed us to where we are today. And if we're able to unpack those issues, then when we get to the question of what do we do about them, then we might have better solutions. So
yeah, I just want to make a quick distinction, you know, between different types of violence against blacks in different parts of the world. In America, for instance, it's more to do with race, I think. Historically, the black person had been seen as a property. His body is always a property. And the institution itself allowed for the lynching, for the buying and selling of black people. And if you read, for instance, like Ta-Nehisi Coates' book about Between the World and I, he explains it so well that the police is nothing but a continuation of that legal lynching of black people. Now it's been legalized, it's been made, how do I put it? It's been made okay by the police, by the state, but it's still the same thing if you follow the trend, if you follow the history of it. So we look at Africa, now we're all black people. I think it has more to do with, well, maybe apart from South Africa, for instance, where you have the racial divide and all that, but in places like, say, Nigeria or West Africa and things like that, it's more to do with the ruler and the ruled, the powerful and the unpowerful. In one of my books, I made an example where I went to the airport, and I'm always interested to see the conditions of the laboratory, for instance, the toilets. You go, the toilets never work in the airport. And then you go upstairs in the business class lounges, they work perfectly, Why is it that the toilets downstairs don't work, but you go to the lounges upstairs and it works? It's about classes, so that you're almost forced to deal with these quotidian issues every day. You don't have time to think. You are being kept down by poverty. You don't get your salary at the end of the month. You don't get health care. These things should be, given to you as a matter of course. Every government should be able to give you that. But you are denied that. And the rich people, when they get sick, they go to America, they go to London because they can afford it, and they make sure things don't work on the ground. So there's that, disregard for the, small life, if you like, for the poor person who gets lynched for stealing Gary because he's hungry. And that's really the distinction for me.
Excellent. Keenan, so while on the one hand, we can trace back some of the root causes of this to our colonial past, even in the Niger Delta, as I believe she pointed out, some of those vestiges still remain. Why don't we see a similar outrage against, say, the political elite or the political class, whose actions or inactions lead to more lives lost than the dozen or 2 dozen black lives that have been lost in America? Because if we can understand that maybe that's where we also need to spend or invest more of our emotions in trying to solve these things that are real problems for us in this part of the world.
So first of all, I want to say that I don't think that emotionally it's not costly to care about both. At least in my mind, it doesn't cost me anything, and I see a continuum. Some of it is race, and like Helon has been saying, a lot of it here is class. And I think since we Africans, we don't like to go back into our history because we are scared of what we might find there. But our leaders, traditional rulers, the Oba said today that they signed a pact of friendship. Did you guys catch that? It happened in Ghana as well. There was this whole treaty they signed. It was called the Fanti Pact or something. Basically, it's like appeasement. And that is that our leaders since time immemorial will betray us. I don't think that's a particular African situation. I think that's what power does. They betray people. Power works in its own interest. So we continue to have this situation where it's manifest here. It's a very hard question for me because we are facing elections in Ghana. And we come up, at least I come up with all sorts of theories, one of them being that I think middle class Africans middle class Africans have abandoned Africa. That's one of my theories. And so we allow the political class, to engage with our own people on levels that we don't want to do anymore. So you will sit in a forum in Ghana, and people will be talking about, Ghana has so many languages. Ghana is like what, the size of Lagos? It will be like, oh, but how are we going to communicate? These are Ghanaians, middle class, civil society. And then on the other hand, there are the politicians who have no problems at all organizing themselves into political parties, getting into cars, however good or bad they are, and going to communicate with the very people they want to reach for votes. So I don't know what the solution is as to where we get our outrage. I mean, I don't know. But what I do know is that, you know, we just need to do a better job not abandoning ourselves. Because we have to do a better job understanding class, like Hilon is saying. And we have to, this is the only way. We can't just let a bunch of people who want to oppress us, because they've always oppressed us, get away with it. And then, that's why it's easy to express outrage at America about what happens in America, because it doesn't require African middle class to do anything but express outrage. But when it comes to our lives here, we fail time and time again to advocate. If we advocate and our own people are in a better situation, that we are progressively freer. There was an independence movement we have abandoned. It wasn't just about changing flags. We were supposed to get free. We are still not free. And if we don't work for that freedom, that freedom helps me. Because right now, if I get into a car accident on an Accra road, the doctors who should have been looking after me, everything, they are sitting in villages, or what you people call slums. So I don't know. This is just one theory.
Okay, so we've unpacked class. You know, we've also talked about a bit of our past. In South Africa, I think the issues are more crystallized. In fact, last night, interestingly, on TV, I saw the case of the coffin. Yeah, and it just showed that, you know, although we're a couple of years away from the end of apartheid, that we're still quite in it. Because the attitude that led to, so the story is that two white South Africans put a black South African in a coffin, you know, beat him up and put him in a coffin. And I think it's all coming from the same point.
And buried him.
And buried him,
yeah,
alive. Alive. I mean, but he didn't die. That's the really good part of the story.
But so, he almost died.
Yeah, he almost died, but you know, he didn't die. So the question really is, and I see what's happening in South Africa with the fees must fall and roads must fall and so on. How have you, in that movement, you know, defined what Africa is facing? And where I want to go with this question is, if we've now unpacked everything, what can we then learn from the Black Lives Matter movement that has kept it in mainstream media? Because I think why they've been able to make whatever achievements they've achieved so far is that they've been able to move it from the fringes to mainstream media. So what are some of these issues, and what do we learn from that movement that can help the Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa and some of the movements that need to start in other parts of Africa?
Well, I think particularly, well, I mean, for many of us, 1994 was a transfer of political power. It was not a transfer of economic power. And so sometimes many of us, you know, are also of the school of thought that the insistence on the focus on attitudes is a problem. You know, the insistence on friendship and those kind of things without talking about the real transfer of power through redistribution of resources, talking about land and those kind of things, is why we continue to be in the situation. And then we can keep performing outrage and being surprised, oh, that a white man would do that. Yes, he would, because he can. In South Africa, it's quite, you know, there's not much to it, right? And I think for me, the biggest thing that I would just, if we're starting to look at solutions here, this is a global issue. Global blackness is what we need to be thinking about. So the fact that black people can die of malaria here, and Chibok girls, and the fact that black man can be killed and shot in America, it's all of our issues. You cannot be, if African Americans are not free, you will not be free here in Nigeria, right? If black South Africans are not free, you will not be free here, because whiteness is a global system. We're seeing the fact that there's this sweep right now with Brexit and Trump and whatnot. We also need to start seeing that this is a global system, right? And our solutions need to start looking that way. It's not surprising that Black Lives Matter would be in the mainstream because it is in the US. So the proximity to whiteness, so the seat of global white supremacist capital is in America. So of course CNN is going to be beaming that. But then when we do what we're doing in South Africa, it's not necessarily going to go onto CNN. And we also need to maybe move away from this desire to be included in those mainstream, i.e. those networks that don't include us, that are not owned by us? Are we opening up those channels of communications and asking what is happening in Nigeria? International solidarity is what we need. We need to know that if something has happened in Nigeria, you have someone you're going to call in South Africa to say, go and march to the Nigerian consulate and put pressure on them. If something happens here in South Africa as well, people must go and march to the South African embassy. And if we continue to isolate ourselves, I think we need to not underestimate the power of global whiteness to consolidate itself and to backlash, right? And we see this every time, whether it's your Latin American countries, whether it's let's say Zimbabwe, whatever. There will always be a backlash when you try and extricate yourself from it. So we cannot continue to want to isolate our movements. It needs to be that we are in global solidarity. I think it's important that we're having conversations like this. But then now to really be serious about creating those networks. I've seen that with the student movements, that over time we've started to see we need to talk to, let's say, even what's happening in Namibia, for example. There's a student movement there, so I need to talk to our brothers and sisters and say, what is happening? How do we support you? Even within that, I think in South Africa, to just give a little bit more nuance, sometimes it's almost as if violence is most shocking when it's vertical, not when it's horizontal. So i.e., when I kill my black brother, these blacks, this is what they do to each other. Inner city violence, mob violence, whatever. But as soon as it goes upwards and it starts affecting white property and that kind of thing, that's when it goes into the mainstream. That's why when there have been struggles since the beginning of the end of apartheid that have happened on historically black campuses and whatnot, nothing really happens because we expect you to want to kill each other anyway. It's different when it spills onto and starts threatening white bodies. And we need to be aware of those kind of dynamics when we build our networks of solidarity.
Thank you. Now, let's explore something here. You brought up Brexit and the Trump elections, and also what we've seen happen across Latin America and parts of Europe, where previously very silent majority are beginning to speak out and voice their opinion. The issue here, is it really a black problem, or is it a problem with the world order and the economic and political structures globally that have completely isolated a group of people, and it's worked for the elite and hasn't worked for most people below that class? And if we changed the narrative from being a black problem to a global problem, would that help us solve the black problem we have? I wonder, I'll come to you in a minute, but I wonder if Aisha has an opinion on this.
Would that help us solve the black problem?
The black problem by making it a global issue.
I think only partly. I mean, as you said, rational people who are not populists, who are not running for election, can say it's globalization, it's the economy, it's the fact that inequality has increased. But people like Trump want to say it's because of the others, because it's easy to say that. That's an easy target, and he's not going to be the first person to do that. So, yes, we've seen, the world has had phases where when a country is down, when things are difficult, the easy target, even though, yes, rational people know that what's going on is it's the economy, people are feeling deprived, people are feeling cut off, they feel threatened. But what becomes easy to sort of galvanize people is to say, no, it's the other people, it's the immigrants, it's the... So we can try and say, we can actually reframe, we can try to reframe and change the narrative and say, no, it's not black people that are the problem, it's not others that are the problem, it's about the economy. But how effective will we be if the truth is that gap still exists, if people are convinced? And don't forget that we have a new lexicon now, post-truth. So people can say, I don't care that it's not true. I don't care that it's not, there's no facts to back up what I think. But somebody that I believe in, somebody that I think represents me has said this thing, and I want to believe it because it matches and it suits the narrative that I have in my head. How do you deal with that? So for me, honestly, looking at the way the world is going, there's this sense of, let's focus on ourselves, let Africa build ourselves up. Yes, one of the pains about Black Lives Matter in America is because it's sort of state-sponsored. It's the police killing, the people are supposed to protect. But on the flip side, many of the people who are against Black Lives Matter do point out what she did, that they'll say, yeah, but you people kill each other all the time. The same thing back home. Yes, there's responsibility on the government to do what it's supposed to do, to protect us, to serve, to make sure that when one life is taken, there's law and order so that people get justice, so people know that it's not nice to take somebody's life. There's no punishment, there's no deterrence. But on the flip side, are you going to blame government for the fact that we burnt a 7-year-old for stealing Gary? Are you going to blame government for the fact that somebody chopped off a woman's head in Kano because they thought, that's not government, that's us. So I'm not saying that, not to absolve government, but I'm saying it's a circular problem. Like, we ourselves don't seem to want to move from being objects and subjects to actually owning ourselves and actually trying to protect and love ourselves. And again, I'm not sure what the answer is, but I'm saying change the narrative, but we can't change what is in people's hearts. That's harder to do.
Sure. Helen, I'd like you to address that, but also look at the angle of, is it government or is it not government? The people react because they're angry, they're hungry. Whose job is it, to make sure that the economy works for everyone?
Yeah, when you look at the trend around the world, what's similar in most parts of the world, especially in the West, you tend to see that the poorer neighborhoods are Black neighborhoods. That's a fact, You also tend to realize that it's not as if these people want to be poor. It's not as if they want to kill each other, It's just that they lack the opportunity to better themselves. And there's a dissimilarity in opportunities between neighborhoods, between schools. See, Black schools are quite different from white schools, And it's deliberately kept so sometimes. There's lack of funding, there's all these things.
It's structural.
Structural. So it's not as if they want to be poor. It's not as if they want to kill each other. That's the way it is. Whether it's in India, you see, it's different parts of the world. When I say Black, I don't just want to stay with Africans, but it's just basically people of color, and then you find the West, the white West, disproportionately has the means and all that. So one thing with power, one thing with privilege is that people never give up their privilege willingly. You have to take it, If you want to move forward, you have to fight for it. They would never give it to you. There's always going to be that. They will make laws, they will make structures, and they'll always keep you that way, So the thing is, what do you do about that? Whether in Africa, whether in America, and what we have to learn from the Black Lives Matter movement is how bold it is, how dynamic it is. These are people who would go and take the mic from, Bernie Sanders, for instance, in front of CNN, so that you have the strategies that they do to get publicity, to be in your face, to use the media, to use all these things to conscientize people, to raise awareness. Not all people are going to like it, but there it is. You can't run away from it. Blacks are being killed disproportionately. And these are statistics, these are facts. So whether you like it or not, they are just bringing it to your attention. So the more you talk about it, the more you learn about it, the more you begin to, if you're a good person, would want to do something. How do I contribute to this? And that's what we have to learn. In Africa, we sometimes don't give ourselves enough credit, though. There are, historically, moments when we have done that.
Yes.
Our history, we're not given freedom on a platter. In Kenya, they had to fight, the Mau Mau had to fight the British and kick them out, In Africa, in Ghana, Nigeria, we also have this moment where people just stood up and said, no, enough is enough. In Burkina Faso, people actually marched and kicked Blaise Compaoré out of his palace. So there are moments like this. So it's not totally dark and without hope. What we need to do is just to get a structure, to begin to talk to each other and really be systematic about these things, and just take it, just take the power.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Kinan, some thoughts on what the solutions could be?
Oh, solutions. I wanted to talk about the global and the question you posed.
Yes.
Because the global space is a killer of Black people. And I hate the word global because it will kill me unless it decolonizes. And I'm not going to do the work to decolonize that space because it just demands too much from global blackness. Let me say that, pan-blackness, okay? And the best we have been and will be is when we understand that. And just like Elon is saying, we understood that we needed to free ourselves, because at the time when we were colonized, that was the global world. And we took ourselves out of that system. It is not possible, therefore, to say that if we reframed the our so-called black problem as a global problem, is that going to help us? Never. It's never going to happen. And we don't need that kind of, no, that's just genocide 2.0. So we have to, and the other thing is that, now, there is such a thing as global whiteness, and it has a lot of power. So, and we, the elites of pan-blackness, like to do as much as we can to associate ourselves with that global power. We must stop that immediately. It is not going to lead to our freedom. Never has. Again, I repeat, it was always when we took ourselves out of that environment and said, look, we need to be here, that we have freed ourselves. And so we need to, and I think it's much harder now, because since we all started the independence movement and things were clear, they were clear, we went through coups and all sorts of destabilizing things, and now pan-blackness elite finds it too much of a burden to kind of conceive ourselves away from global whiteness and power. But that's something, again, we have to figure out how to do that. We have to figure out how to do that. I don't know, I mean, there have been books that have been written, we are at literary events. We should read, and we should look at those, what has been written. Is there a way that, I'm not saying go back to the past or anything, but what exactly do we do? Everything, I think, most of it has been spelled out, at least the ideological framework. And a lot is being written about decolonizing. But we you know, these days when you bring up, you know, these kinds of words, people look at you like you are blaming white people, which I do. The other thing is, I want to talk about government. No, we cannot blame our government enough. One of the reasons is that government is us. Again, I think we approach and I hate the term post-colonial Africa because we are not there, but let's say post-independence Africa. We approach the government as though it was the colonial entity. No, the governments are us. Some of us are now, Ghana is now living under a Fourth Republic constitution. Well, we wrote that constitution and we went to a referendum and we voted for it. So when we demand from our governments, let's all understand, we demand from us. And so we must step up. So we cannot blame our government enough, and we must do more to make sure our governments do the things they are supposed to be doing. Because that is the only way, again, I mean, we can talk about what business people can do and individuals, but it is about law. How can a 7-year-old allegedly be burned to death, and to this day, we don't know what the truth is? Well, who's supposed to find that out if it is not the government? So we must stop this thing where, you know, we are not the West. The West can go through all sorts of things. We are the government. We can blame our government. We can look to our leaders for better leadership. We can look to them and we must insist on answers, because there's a 7-year-old, I mean, parents, I mean, really. So no, this, you know, we are divorcing ourselves because we are saying we are failing our democracies. Well, who is failing the democracies? Isn't it us? If we collectively come together and we say this is our constitution and we watch it fail, who's failing? So solutions, I don't know.
So, well, I mean, I think you spoke on both sides, because the approach or the discussion around holding government responsible is that if this were a room of average Nigerians, because this is not an average audience, they would still point to a government, right? The question is, how do we raise the consciousness of the masses to see a sense of urgency on getting our government, the elected people, and the bureaucracy to do the right thing. Now, to conclude on that is when we go back to the golden years of Africa, the independence and so on, there was someone out there who we were fighting, right? Now that it's Africans in these positions, it's difficult for the average person out there to see their role in fighting.
Okay.
And how do we get it to a point where there should be more outrage out there? How do we raise that consciousness so that there is more outrage that demands results from the people who have been elected or people who are employed in the bureaucracy to get the job done?
Well, first of all, I hate the word masses. I hate a lot of things. Number two, we have made our elections or our democracy all about elections because some bunch of people somewhere have to get power. This comes straight back to middle class and educated elite. Because you know what? It is too much to ask for poorer people to do the work that we should be doing. It's not going to happen. This is why it is not, because we keep saying, how are we going to get the masses to, no. It is our job. It is our job precisely because whatever the output of the services that the governments have put out, we have benefited the most. It is our responsibility, as hard as we think our lives are, there is room for us to pick up, because we are the only ones who can. I don't know where a woman, I don't know where they are supposed to find the inner strength to fight the very systems that we are benefiting from and make our lives better by no. It is our job. We are the ones who collude with leadership in Africa. So let's leave the masses to mass. And it is our job. Every single one of us, have we not benefited from government services? Government.
Panache.
I think I really like what you're saying, because this assumption of the masses, the problem lies with the masses. I think the problem lies with us. When Fanon talks about the comprador class, it's us sitting in this class, in this room, wringing our hands about what our government is going to do. And the key part is that even if our governments are there, they don't operate in a vacuum. There are geopolitics, there are global politics. You can go and read Clinton's emails and read why she bombed Libya, blah, blah. We don't operate in a vacuum. I hold our governments responsible in as far as they continue to collude with those global systems that would oppress us. That is where I hold them responsible to say, what kind of deals are you signing off on? Are you signing off of our resources? What are you doing? Are you making sure that you put our people first? I also find the discussion about governance tricky because it's very decontextualized or ahistorical, as if there haven't been African leaders, and I don't want to go into some glorious African past, but generally, when a leader, and this is actually across the world, when a leader has said we're going to put the needs of the people first, what happens? This is not just Africa. Across the world, they get killed, don't they? Right? Whether you can talk about a Sankara, you can talk about what's happened in Latin America, and these things, the idea that whiteness or the black problem is a regional issue, it's a global issue. The Industrial Revolution, for example, could not have happened without slavery. That extra jumpstart of labor that does not need to be paid is what got us, or gave the kickstart to the global economy. And these things continue right now in the present. So when we have, all this is to say that our tools of analysis are very important so that we can effectively fight. Because sometimes then we can be busy fighting each other, but we don't actually attack what is really the problem. So I'll give you an example of what I mean by our governments colluding with global forces that would oppress people locally is in South Africa, the Marikana massacre. 34 black mine workers were killed for demanding a fairer wage. Now, our government, our current deputy president sat on the board of that company. The company Lonmin, which is a global company. Right? Because these blacks are asking for a better wage. So they must be killed. They are threatening our property. So you, our man, our native affairs commissioner, because that's the conditions under which you're allowed to have a seat on the board. You, because there was an email that he sent specifically that said, concomitant action must be taken, an email that was sent to the South African Police Commissioner. So you see the collusion
Sure.
of capital and our government. So that's how I hold my government accountable, to say, how are you allowing this to happen in this day and age? I need to make sure that when I speak about my government, I'm talking about it within the global context, but as well as the local context.
Sure. I mean, you're absolutely right. Cloud Ake has a brilliant book on that, documents this. But Aisha, before we open it up to the audience, there was enough, and I'm not trying to personalize this, but there was enough outrage you felt back in 2015 that made you run for office to probably help fix things. How do we get, I guess that's the burning question for me, how do we get enough outrage amongst the people in this room and the people we do not want to call masses, to say enough is enough, and not to use another mantra or campaign, but to say, okay, yes, there might be some things from the colonial past, yes, there could be some international global linkages, yes, there could be, yes, but enough is finally enough. Yeah? You tried it with that, it didn't, but what have you learned from that experience that could then lead to a bit of a movement here?
I think in terms of my experience and what led me there and what we're talking about now, what I would say is moving forward, I think we just need to have more of these types of conversations. I think we need to organize more. In a way, I feel like we know what the issues are, we know what the problems are, they're all out there, we even have visuals, we have pictures. It's just to sort of take that together and put it into a plan and stand on it. I mean, we've talked about the things that we've done in the past. I would like to use the Bring Back Our Girls as an example of something that's had staying power. So we have an example of standing on an issue. So we can develop on that, we can build on that. We have that, we have Fees Must Fall, we have the Zimbabweans and This Must End, Tagajuma or something. So we have examples. So for me, there is this sense of helplessness, and maybe it comes from because we are all part of it in a way. Maybe that's what, for me, that's what I'm getting, speaking specifically about Nigeria and the political class. And I do think, like many people have said about Nigeria, that the problem is political. I honestly believe that our problem is more political than anything, and if we don't fix the politics, we'll never fix anything that we're talking about. So if we really want to change our politics, then we have to own up to the fact, that's we, the elite, the people in this room, the intellectuals, that we are part of the problem, that we are colluding with the government, that they are our friends, we go and drink champagne at their parties, and all those types of things. So there's that sense of, there's a sense of, I don't know what it's called, but sort of almost like dead weight. We feel unable to move because we're going to have to attack people that we know. And unless we're ready to do that for the sake of our future and our children, I think we'll just keep having these conversations at the 10th Ake, 20th Ake, and nothing will really change. Yeah, we just have to decide that things are going to change. And we haven't made that decision.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open it up for audience participation. We'll take a few questions. We'll take all the questions, and then we'll respond. And in responding, that would be our closing statements as well. I see a hand up there, and there's a lady in the back.
A few questions, because it was all very interesting. Thank you very much. One. Okay, I'll narrow it down to one. So, for example, you gave how it's our fault as middle-class elites who are educated as to not holding government accountable, which I agree with. But if we think about what makes a middle-class person the middle-class person within a capitalist system, it's usually because they have taken the steps to try and accrue some kind of finance, wealth, assets, whatever it is, so they can live comfortably, right? That's most of the reason why people do it, so they can acquire things, they can buy a house, they can buy a car, they can... How do you now expect that person to give that up considering what they've done to get there, just in a more pragmatic sense. I agree with you in terms of theory, but how do we do it pragmatically, get middle-class people to put conscience above what their real driving goal is, which is comfort?
Thank you. There was a hand, yeah, the lady, and then we'll come to the front, the lady behind her.
There was a video that was posted, I think, on Facebook a few weeks ago with one of the elders of the Black Panther movement. I think she's in her 70s now. And she was saying that the biggest failing of Black Lives Matter is the fact that it doesn't have an ideology. I'd like the panel to speak about that. And I'd also like to be abusive and squeeze in one more question, please. Panasha mentioned her involvement in the student movement. I find it very interesting that the Black Lives Matter movement also initially in America was started by women, but they did not become the face of this movement. And there's something that runs in parallel with what happened in South Africa with the student movement as well, and Fees Must Fall. So I'd appreciate some commentary on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. To the front, yeah. I know, I'm going to come to that.
Hi, thank you. Listening to all of you speaking, I've been swaying, saying, no, I don't agree with that, and then say, oh yes, I agree with that. So I've been going through emotions as you discussed. But one of the things that, that is quite clear to me is that Black lives have not gained value yet, everywhere in the world. So when a Black life is lost, there's no consequence yet. Now, I remember when I was growing up, an American girl was killed in Kenya. I think it was killed by Moi administration. And this girl was thrown in the national park. And later she was collected and taken back. Now, America apparently tried to cover up for Kenya. But this father of this girl was not having it. For 20 years, he spent money, he borrowed money, and followed up the Kenyan government until the truth came out. And for me, that means that they've invested money in a white body. In fact, in Uganda, we have a saying, you can kill the Nigerian, you can kill the Ugandan, you can kill the Asian, but don't touch the white body.
Thank you.
Now, in African Americans are saying...
the question...
This is the question.
Yeah.
Now, this African Americans are saying that until Africa invests value in the African body, the Americans, the African Americans, the South Americans, the wherever, it's not going to happen. I mean, what do you think?
So the question is, how do we improve the value
do you really think that it's up to Africa to invest value in the black body?
Can we come to this side? There's a gentleman.
Just like the last person has a question, I have also been turned inside out listening to this. At some point, my conclusion is that all lives matter. And what we're facing right now is that in Africa, if I'm to localize it to Nigeria, the value of human life has been lost to corruption. And that's why a 7-year-old boy can be killed, a woman can be killed here, somebody was preaching and money was... So really, is it really a dichotomy between white and black, but about humanity? We're talking about beneath this skin. What is beneath this skin? Is a human being.
Yeah.
The same structures. There's nothing different under the skin.
Sure.
So how does this dialogue lead us to that point where we can stand as human beings, whether white or black, and we're interested in our own lives?
Thank you very much. I will take the last question and we'll get it. Yeah.
Basically, I think the way power exists currently, it is easy to say, oh, that, say, maybe some middle-class people pander to power, you know, we go and we drink champagne with our rich friends and whatever. But I think it's more than pandering to it. I think it is an addiction for it. And this addiction spreads from middle class to even lower class. If you went around to decolonize, say, Nigeria today, if you only think about how many churches you would have to uproot in a society where we consider our own traditional religions as idolatry, you realize that even these people we don't want to call the masses would lynch you for trying to do that. So the question is, how do you even create the space to allow the waning process that we must have to go through if we are actually going to go through any kind of decolonization? Because I don't think it can be done without any pain.
Without
any pain.
Excellent, thank you.
It's never been easy, you know, to bring about change. It's always been very hard. People die. The Arab Spring guy actually set himself on fire just to make a point. So these are the kind of sacrifices that it might take, you know, to get there. But I want to address the question about the middle class and you know, democracy and all that. I see the way democracy works is that you have the middle class, you know, then you have the rulers, and you have the non-masses, as you say. So when the middle class is the bulwark, as it were, where the democratic parties get their sponsorship. This is the pool from where the leaders emerge. These are the thinkers, these are the people who have the time and the leisure to either oppose the government or to think about, you know, things like that. What happened to us is that our governments, especially the military governments, systematically destroyed the middle class. Right in front of our eyes, our professors, our universities were made just paper degree-given institutions, nothing more. So these are the places where traditionally thinkers, you know, agitation and all these changes kind of come from. But we don't have that anymore. Basically, they've been denuded of these kind of possibilities. So there goes your middle class. So the task ahead of us is kind of really, really more daunting than it had been ever before. At the same time, I think we have more possibilities now than before in terms of communication and organization and models to copy. We have the internet, we have the Twitter, and these are the tools you need to do all these things, to mobilize and to conscientize and to express yourself. And we saw that in the 2015 elections, where people actually came out and spoke against what was going on. You know, we talked about bring back our gas and all that. So I cannot tell you this is exactly how we're going to get there or how we're going to do it. I know that it's a long process, but I know that the conditions exist if we want to do that, and the models exist for us to copy to get there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Kinan, which one do you want to answer?
I think there was a question about the middle class. So in Ghana, people, yeah, he was saying that because they've gotten cars and whatnot. So in Ghana, people get up and go to church, those who are Christians, and they thank God for everything that has come their way. Every single little thing. What has come their way, actually, is what they have benefited from government services. That is what has come their way. It wasn't God, though. It was elite boarding schools. Back in the day, it was stellar university subsidized by poorer Ghanaians. These days, it is being part of a system where the more educated you are, the more slang you spew out, gets you even more power. There's not a single, let's say middle class, rich Ghanaian or even Nigerian who has not benefited from the best that these countries have to offer. So they didn't get their middle class status just by working hard. They have power. What we are saying is, in fact, invest in more power for yourselves by making sure more of your people are free. Because if you want to become an entrepreneur, say, sooner or later you are going to need, maybe you sell computer, you know, these days everybody is a startup, something or the other. If you want people to buy your services, you need more people who are what? Literate. So in fact, I don't see any kind of conflict. If you want more money, free your people. There isn't a, so you don't have to go abroad. But let's disabuse ourselves of middle class or rich Africans working so hard. They have a, oh, let me not even start. So that is what we have to let people know. This whole thing these days where no one wants to talk about their privilege, how the schools they have gone to, how they have old boys and old girls networks that are benefiting them, how the better English you say, no matter how stupid you actually are, gets you access. These are the things we want to talk about. I am not saying that I want to demonize middle class or rich Africans, but we just have to be really honest as to how much we have benefited from whatever. We have taken the most that Africa has to offer. And we want to create, now we want to create more, so that, you know, when you have a health crisis and you don't have time to get on that plane and go to, I don't know, these days it's South Africa, but that you can actually go to your corner hospital in Ghana and be treated for asthma and not die, then we need to free our people.
Sure.
That's all.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wonder if Panashe can talk about the lack of ideology in the Black Lives Matter, and maybe combine that with the what?
I just want to first add the thing about the pain. I think that's the main thing, because just the struggle, why we are moving away from the masses. There's this assumption that these masses are people who need education. I think they probably, particularly in the South African situation, the majority of black South Africans, particularly poor black South Africans, have known that there's no such thing as the Rainbow Nation for a long time. It's only us black middle class who've all of a sudden like, oh my God, it's no longer working after 22 years, but many people have known. So it's just the arrogance that comes, yes, there are masses, but just the arrogance sometimes and the assumptions that we make as we talk about people as if they don't see what is happening is, I think, what we're also trying to get across, as well as absolving ourselves from what political action needs to happen. And like you said, it is a very painful process because you have to give up a lot. Like you're saying, there's much that we benefit from. I can tell you, for example, earlier this year, I got arrested, right? And usually I like to be like, yeah, revolution, you know, that kind of thing. And then I get arrested, and then, luckily we got out after a few days, after a few hours. And that weekend, because it was the Monday we were going to get tried, that weekend I was so inconsolable because I was like, oh my God, my visas, I won't be able to go anywhere because if I've got a criminal record, it means I can't do a whole lot of things. But for the vast majority of people, that is not a concern. The idea that you can travel a visa, who is the kind of person who needs to think about a green card or whatever? It's a particular kind of person, right? It's a particular kind of person who worries about a criminal record because, there's certain kinds of jobs that are available to me. So it's in those moments where I had to also reckon with myself to see how complicit and how much do I benefit from this status quo. And it's just to say, let's be honest with ourselves as we demand these things, because often the reflection in the mirror is not flattering. And I can say that about myself as we go through these things. And that's part of the pain. Beyond the material issues, it's also reckoning with the image of yourself is really difficult. On the ideology thing, I find that interesting because when Angela Davis was in South Africa, she really spoke to a lot of some of the ideologies that pinpoint this, and particularly one of the major, for a lot of movements, particularly around a lot of these black resistance movements, it has been black women and particularly black queer women who have done the hard work of the resistance. And the hard work, which is also the boring work, the not so fun work, the organizing work, because I think sometimes even in as much as I'm of the generation of Twitter and whatnot, that doesn't substitute from organizing work. And it's very tedious work, and it's a whole lot of things. And that's, again, when you see your middle classness, because you're like, oh, but I have to go and do X, Y, Z. And protest time is not the same as middle class time. Things take a whole lot longer than they would otherwise take. And so I think a lot of this has also I can't speak on what Black Lives Matter, their ideologies are like, but I'll talk about our movement. At the beginning, I think there was also a lot of nominal commitment to ideologies. So i.e., we say in name, okay, the 3 pillars are Pan-Africanism, Black consciousness, Black radical feminism. But then, once we are in the trenches, we see how certain things go out the window. At particular moments, we see how the brother who was saying, yeah, feminism, and then someone gets raped when we are doing an occupation, and then all of a sudden, we don't really care about Black women's bodies anymore. So a lot of it has been, the idea of praxis, so theory informing action and action informing theory. It's been going through that. There is a lot of the reading work, but also seeing in practice, what do some of these things do, and how do we form new ways of doing things? So for example, we try things like, how about let's have a flat structure? We don't want a face of the movement, because we've seen what faces have done to us historically. Then sometimes we see that actually sometimes the most efficient way is to have a strong man, for example, and you've seen that with the student movement, where sometimes we've been really, really flat and you wouldn't be able to say who the leader is, and then all of a sudden we've got very strong men, and particularly when very heavily militarized force has come upon us, that's when the movements have become increasingly hyper-masculine and patriarchal, because when I'm facing a police gun, I'm not thinking about, oh, what are the new ways of organizing? I'm like, hey, where are the patriarchs to come and stand? And I say it as a joke, but I mean it because, when police have been called on us very quickly, it becomes very difficult. So that has also challenged a lot of our ideologies, because what happens on the day-to-day and that kind of thing. So I would think that maybe my one critique has been, we have not also, one, looked at the situation of students in historically Black institutions and just particularly historically white areas. So even being able to connect to what is happening in Nigeria, that is our failing. And are we making sure that, for example, I can say white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy and decolonization, but does my mother understand what I'm saying? Does my sister understand? And those kind of things of, are we relating our struggles to the bread and butter issues of our people and ourselves has been a big issue, I think, more than anything else. But I think, for me, the main thing has been the idea, Kwame Torres and Stokely Carmichael has spoken about the difference between mobilization, which is the easy, hey, something has happened, come, I don't know, a student has been shot, let's come around and let's do something about that. On the spot, we release our anger, it's great, but what about the long-term work of organizing? That's also, I think, where we lack right now.
Okay, so they've been shooting daggers at me from back there that we ran out of time 20 minutes ago. There's a question here about the value of Black lives. Aisha, if you can just address that in 1 minute, maybe we can wrap up.
Okay. I'm going to say, for lack of time, and happy to talk more after that, I think it's a mix. We are going to have to put value to our lives. It would definitely help if we had governments that also valued our lives and put structures in place for us to do so. But we also, and maybe it's a chicken and egg thing, I'm not sure which one is going to come first. At this point, I'd like to think that it will have to come from us. We are going to have to demand to government that they have to show and put in place things that show that we value our lives. But there are also very many little ways that we can do that. So for example, one pet peeve, Nigerians, somebody mentioned hospitals. Many of our hospitals are death traps. Many of our doctors are negligent. I know personally people who would want to take hospitals and doctors who've been negligent to court. But what happens? They become the bad person. Your church descends on you, your mosque descends on you, the family descends, we. And then you sort of backslide and say, okay, maybe it's God's will. We have to have value in our lives. If your child dies, if your mother dies and somebody has been negligent, pursue the matter. That's the only way that that hospital and that doctor and those nurses are going to understand that all lives have value. But every time something bad happens to us, we just walk away and throw up our arms and we don't hold the structures responsible. So for me, those are the little things that we can do while we wait to hold and create governments that are more responsive to our needs and show that they value our lives. But right now, both the public and the government don't show that Black lives have any value.
Thank you very much. A round of applause more for the panel, Kenan, Helen, Aisha, and Panashe. We thank you very much. I'm not sure we could have exhausted all the issues under this topic in just an hour's panel. The hope is that we continue these conversations even after this panel. Thank you so much. You've been a great audience.